for the computer. Okay.
Like, if you need to see, oh no, I can't see. Can we take a picture? Yeah, then you get it. Yeah, that's right. So it's right. But they had one in Scotland that was like the rolling roads islands, so they had Google sheep. So they strapped a camera to the sheep. So I would take it. Yeah. Sheep itself.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our special summer event at the ATT, Mansplaining, Gender and Disarmament. We're very pleased that you could join us. This is, as I'm sure you're aware, quite an unusual kind of presentation, but we're confident that you'll find it useful and enjoyable. My name is Richard Lane. I'm the director of the Geneva Disarmament Platform and GDP, and the purpose of the GDP is to convene these kinds of events and other things to discuss pertinent issues in a new way, to explore new angles, and to get people to think perhaps a little differently about the way they conduct their work in the area of Disarmament. So we're very privileged to have an extremely knowledgeable and well-qualified panel with us today. First and most importantly is our mansplainer, Mr. Mann. He's there's a long list of qualifications. I won't bore you with them here, but he is mostly well known as the author of 2 best-selling books, Condescend Your Way to the Top and How to Be Right. I'm sure you've read both of those. He's also got several months of experience in gender issues, so he'll be able to share some of his wisdom with you this afternoon. So thank you, Mr. Mann, for joining us. Also on the panel we have some other knowledgeable people on gender. To my right, Mr. Callum Watson, who's the Project Officer for Gender and Security at the Geneva Centre for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. Very impressive background in gender issues and applying them in a professional setting here in Geneva. Further along we have Ray Atchison, a very small package but very capable one. Ray has worked, I'm sure many of you know, Ray's worked in disarmament for many years. She's director of the Reaching Critical Will program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and has written quite extensively on gender issues, gender-based violence and other things. But Ray's unusual name for a girl. Is that short for something? No. No, right. Finally, on my left is Marion Provencher, who's the Gender Officer at the Gender and Mine Action Program. Marion, you're only 27, is that? It's just it's quite an amazing profile for someone so young. So thank you to our panellists for joining us today. The way we're going to proceed here is we're going to have a kind of a structured conversation among the panel, and then there'll be a chance, of course, for you, the audience, to ask your questions and to join in the discussion. So let's get started, and I'd like to ask Mr. Mann to kick us off, and perhaps by giving us just perhaps a 2-minute introduction on gender and disarmament.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you very much for letting me speak first. Disarmament is one of the oldest mandates of the United Nations. It is therefore imperative that it is followed up on, and it is seen to follow up on it. It traditionally centres around the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, small arms and light weapons, but more and more we're having to focus on new issues such as cybersecurity and the use of artificial intelligence. Of course, as we're looking at disarmament, we need to be very careful to ensure that states remain with the capacity to defend themselves and to militarise against the threats that we face in the new world.
Yes, thanks. I was wondering if you could actually also talk about gender.
Oh yes, definitely. Now we mustn't forget about the women and children. As I've said before, this is an extremely important issue. Gender is an issue that we need to be seen to be taken seriously. In the world today, we find more and more countries have women represented in their governments. In fact, many donor governments today have heads of state that are women. As such, I think as a sector and as an industry, we need to be clear to the world that we tick that box.
Thank you, Mr. Mann, for that very compact introduction. If I can turn now to Ray, perhaps you can tell us what is the differential impact of armed violence on men and women?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Richard, for organising this panel, I think. Women are differentially affected by some weapon systems, by the use, possession...
Can I just clarify something here? I'd like to clarify that all of the evidence we see suggests, or proves that men are almost always the combatants in modern warfare and past warfare. They are therefore those that are affected more concretely by armed violence. And if we really are going to be taking the issue of gender seriously, we need to be planning our interventions based on evidence. All the evidence suggests that men are where we need to be focusing this issue, and that women in most of the countries that we work in are more likely to be homemakers and staying, looking after children, therefore less at risk of armed violence. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely interruption. That's what I started my intervention by saying that women are differentially affected by weapons, because I think we all recognize that men are more likely to kill each other, but that doesn't mean that women aren't affected by the use or possession or trade in arms. There are some physical ways that women are differentially impacted. For example, when it comes to nuclear weapons, women's bodies are more susceptible to radiation poisoning, and also passing this along to children and having children being born with birth defects. There are also social ways in which women are differentially impacted by weapon systems. For example, when we see the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and the destruction of towns and cities, some of the things that we find are that women are the ones that are expected to still prepare food, collect food, go to the markets that are being bombed. For example, if there is mass displacement, women are more targeted in terms of gender-based violence for rape, sexual exploitation, forced marriage, harassment, trafficking, etc. And there's also different ways that women are disproportionately more impacted by men when it comes to weapons, and that is through the use of guns and other weapons to commit gender-based violence. For example, in the household, if there is a gun present in a situation of domestic violence, women are approximately 500% more likely to die just by having the presence of a gun there. So there are ways in which women and also girls can be differentially and disproportionately impacted. Thank you.
Yes. I think it's easy to trawl out the statistics. Have you considered, for example, that 80% of those people that commit suicide with a firearm are men? That's it.
Thank you. I think we'll move on. You wanted to speak about DDR? Yes. Well, I think we'll let Mr. Mann have another go. Why, Mr. Mann, why is it important to consider gender in disarmament, demobilisation, reintegration of DDR programs?
Well, as I have already very clearly mansplained to you and to the panel, most combatants in armed conflict are men. Recent research suggests that conflict flares up again when ex-combatants and at-risk youth, principally male youth, are not given the opportunities that they need to stabilise their life. One of the main reasons for running DDR programs is to stabilise a country post-conflict. We should therefore focus our efforts directly onto looking at ways to stabilise the life and livelihoods of the young men and former fighters, which are also men, in these countries. Yes, there is an important subsidiary issue in dealing with women's rights and women's opportunities after the war has finished. However, in my expert opinion, this is something that should be dealt with differently through an alternative framework or by some other people.
I see. Carla, would you like to add something to that?
Thank you very much for organising this event. It's a privilege to be here. While I wouldn't disagree with Mr. Mann that it is important to consider youth, I think it's something that a lot of us have experienced. I mean, for us, work in disarmament, you imagine who you're going to have to work with, and you think of a room full of young, angry men. But just because you don't see something, it doesn't mean that it isn't there. And that's something that I've certainly learned in the work that I've done, particularly with security sector reform. So, of course, there are large numbers of male combatants, but there are also women who are in combat roles. Now, why is it that we don't always see these women in the first place? Well, sometimes it can be the case that women are stigmatized for having these conflict roles and therefore don't try and access some of the services that are provided in disarmament. It can also be the case that they are in fact present, but it's our own stereotypes that lead us to think, in fact, that they're cooks, or that they're playing some kind of care role for the combatants, or perhaps their partners, coerced or not coerced, of the combatants themselves. It actually transpires that in a large number of conflicts, women do play conflict roles. They even play commanding roles, particularly in left-wing movements. So it's important for us to consider that in our disarmament activities. That being said, I think a lot of the disarmament activities we have make this assumption that female civilians are going to play quite a large role in providing care work, and that goes back to some of the points that Ray was making earlier. Women are the ones expected to cook, perhaps to look after injured combatants. They might be injured physically or psychologically, and also they might have to be there while the men are not employed, so that they're keeping the household going. So it's important to consider the role they're playing, and often they're not being funded or not being paid for that. Of course, women in and of themselves, even if they're not playing a caregiving role, also have an inherent right to benefit from the economic development that we see in a post-conflict situation. So it's not just a question of practicality, there's also a rights issue there. But if we're going to talk about people who might not be initially present, the people that we might not initially see, we also mustn't forget that there are male civilians. Now, often these male civilians don't have access to disarmament programs simply because they don't have arms. But that's not a reason to exclude them from post-conflict peace settlements. Otherwise, we're in a situation where they're simply going to be excluded because they didn't resort to violence. So it's important that they also have a right to benefit from economic and social development that we see after conflict. And finally, of course, when we look deeper, we sometimes see that there are people who don't fit into that binary category. So there are Hijra people, for example, third gender in Nepal, and there's also transgender people in Colombia. Pretty much wherever you look, you'll find that actually gender is quite diverse. So I think whether we like it or not, gender will be influential in the post-conflict settlement, will play a role in shaping that. We need to consider what kind of society we're trying to create. Are we trying to create one in which we value certain principles such as gender equality, or are we going to be rewarding the kinds of militarism that we've seen previously?
Well said, my friend. From that, I think we're essentially saying the same thing. It's very good to have consensus among experts.
Indeed, a very comprehensive response. Thank you, Callum. I wonder now, coming back to you, Mr. Mann, if we could ask how you would assess the representation of women in disarmament forums.
It's a bit of a thorny issue, I'm afraid. But let's face it, we've been making progress in recent years. Disarmament is a principally male-dominated sector, and I think we can all agree that, in the end, men are going to be more competent at dealing with this type of issue. Women are largely better at looking at things like human rights and developing aid and the more sort of yogurty stuff that this sector is involved in. No, but saying that, I think we have made progress. That we do have programs, we do have sort of affirmative action programs in some parts of the world that allow to sort of balance the scales and help us bring women into the fold despite their natural disadvantage.
Marion, perhaps we could ask your views on this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Richard, for inviting. When it comes to the representation of women in disarmament forums, I guess that, as Mr. Mann's answer suggests, women, and especially women diplomats, tend to be associated with quote-unquote soft themes.
I actually said yogurty.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Mann. So, quote-unquote yogurty themes. You said human rights, I can add to that education, healthcare, women's affairs, you've heard that. And women are less likely to be associated with quote-unquote hard themes like security and disarmament. And for me, these are stereotypes that really are one big cause of the reason why women are underrepresented in disarmament forums. And that's my argument here, is that women are underrepresented in disarmament forums. And I have, there's been a lot of research done on that, and I have a few facts here. And I think one of the research says, yes, almost half of all country delegations at any disarmament meeting are likely to be composed entirely of men. I'm going to repeat that. That's half of all country delegations composed entirely of men. And for me, that's an indicator not of the fact that men are, and I'm going to quote Mr. Mann here, more naturally competent at disarmament. For me, that's an indicator of what topics and areas we think women should be involved in. And there's a lot of work to be done to increase that representation of women in disarmament forum and discourses and make it better.
Again, I think it's an interesting statistic, but have you ever thought that this is perhaps because someone somewhere, or a lot of people in a lot of places, have made a decision to put men on the panel because they simply know that they will do a better job?
I don't think so. I'm happy to share my sources with you, Mr. Mann.
Well, perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion with Oops. I'm not very competent at this sort of thing. We can come back to that in the general discussion a bit later. Mr. Mann, I mean, if we're talking about security, and you spoke about security in your initial remarks, if we want to increase security, and I think we all do, is investing in the military the most effective way to do that?
Do you mean investment in defence?
Yes.
And if so, yes. And that's as much for the sake of our wives, our daughters and our sisters as for anyone else. The threats to our security are growing. We see Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, recent issues in North Korea, the rise of ISIS and Islamic terrorism, and we need to be able to respond to this. We need to project an image of power and stability and be able to make it clear to the world that we are willing and able to defend ourselves against those that would harm us. And the best way to do that is through the threat of violence.
Well, that's very clear. Perhaps from another perspective I can turn to Ray.
Yes, I have another perspective. I would say that military expenditures directly affect the availability of national resources that could be used for other things other than the projection of violence and brute power around the world, which doesn't seem to have sent us on a very productive path globally in terms of socio-economic development or stability or safety or security of any people anywhere. I would say that with the rising military expenditure happening, we're looking at about $1.7 trillion in 2016.
I think it was actually 1.69. We're not quite there yet.
$1.69 trillion on military spending in 2016, but meanwhile there was only 2% rise in peace and security aid that would be spent on gender equality in the same period. Also, we're looking at about a 60% increase of military spending between the year 2000 and 2015, but meanwhile funding for women in civil society dropped by about half in this same period. So we can see that there are deliberate choices being made between spending in the military and the path that has put us on, and the alternative paths that we could stake out. And we have an opportunity here when we're dealing with the arms trade at the arms trade meeting at the Human Rights Council that's going on the same time this week, to start changing our mindset and thinking differently about how we invest our resources.
I think that's the most sensible thing I've heard all day. 60% increase since the year 2000. If we play our cards right, by 2020 we could be at 90%.
I don't know what to say to that.
Well, time will tell. Moving on, I'd like now to explore if there's a link between masculinities and militarization. What do you think about that, Mr. Mann?
Whether or not there's a link, I think that the real issue is that full disarmament is simply unattainable. I think in the modern world, with the security threats that we face, to seriously disarm our nation and our people would be a sign of weakness to the rest of the world. It would be something that's both irrational and completely irresponsible.
No?
Yes, if I can answer to that. I sort of hinted at it with my previous answer. But armament and disarmament policies and practices are deeply, deeply linked with gender and ideas that we have of gender roles. And Mr. Mann's answer was kind of a good example to illustrate that the possession of weapons and the readiness to use military action are really deeply linked with these masculine notions of power and control and domination and strength.
Nonsense. You haven't read my book. History is full of examples of strong, powerful women. Joan of Arc, for example, lifted the siege of Orleans in 9 days. Elizabeth I defeated the Spanish Armada.
This is really unacceptable.
Calm down, dear. I'm having a conversation. I will continue. Indira Gandhi's state of emergency in India in the 1970s is another example. Do you think that Margaret Thatcher was named the Iron Lady by pandering to the whims of...
I'm terribly sorry there. Sorry, what was your first name?
You can call me Mr.
I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Mann. I think you've made your views very clear on this issue, but Marion is actually an expert on this topic, and I'd quite like to hear what she has to say on the role of masculinity and gender roles in disarmament.
Well, fair enough, old chap. No, thank you very much for pointing that out, and I would like to apologise to you, Richard. Obviously, this is an issue that I feel very strongly about. I am an expert, and it's quite easy to get carried away when we're talking about this sort of thing. So please carry on.
No, that's quite all right. Marion, did you want to finish off?
Yes, thank you. As I was saying, disarmament is quite linked with these masculine notions of power, control, and strength. And these really are social constructs. And we have the opportunity, maybe, with the work that we do, to influence that and hopefully change these masculine notions so that they transform from being the ones of power and control to becoming ones of cooperation and negotiation, and hopefully have a more sustainable peace in the future. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Marion. Well, what we'll do now is we're going to wrap up the panel part of this and open up the floor. But just to conclude this part, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to suggest what we can do concretely, each of us, to integrate gender perspectives into our daily work in disarmament. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ray.
Oh, I'm allowed to take the floor again, am I? Oh, excellent. How nice. Thank you.
No, actually, sure. I should really, perhaps, Mr. Mann.
Sorry. Thank you. I did think there was something wrong there. I, for one, am very glad to see that our panel of experts are all on the same page. I think it's important that through this discussion we've managed to really address the real issue, which is that we need to maintain our focus on the sort of the main problem, which is how do we disarm and defend at the same time? And how do we make sure that we design programs which allow us to do that without getting cluttered up by the sort of white noise that seems to confuse and confound events like this, important events like this. Thank you.
Callum.
Okay, well, I'd actually quite like to come back to one of the points that Marion was making earlier, and I think it is really important to consider the way in which we are shaping gender roles through our disarmament programs. I think we also have to examine what we're bringing ourselves in terms of our own gender bias. So are we basing our interventions on gender stereotypes? Are they things that we bring from our own country? Or are we actually basing it on the facts? Have we actually reached out to the different groups of women, men, girls, boys, and gender minorities in a country? And how are we actually contributing to gender equality in the end? Are we contributing to a sense of the importance of gender equality and the rule of law in the country? Or are we simply reinforcing the gender inequality that we saw before conflict broke out in the first place?
Thank you. Marion.
Yes. So final points, things that we can, I think, concretely do is first be aware of our own bias. And of course, a lot of it is unconscious. But some part of it is not, and that's where we have a lot of influence. So step number one is to educate ourselves. I would say then step number two is there's maybe a tendency to, and we call that in feminist theory, sprinkle gender and stir. That's not how it works. If you want a program to be gender responsive, you can't just at the end sprinkle gender and stir the whole thing and hopefully it's going to be responsive. No, it would be much better to take gender into account at the very early stages of whatever policy, program, project activity that you're planning. And then, of course, integrate it whenever it's relevant, integrate it throughout the development of a project or a policy or a practice. And then finally, something that you can do concretely when you're working on a project in disarmament is to ask gender experts or gender connoisseurs for help. Maybe you have people working on gender with you, maybe you don't, but there's certainly one person who's more aware of it and can help you. Don't hesitate. We love to hear from people. Just come and ask for help. That's why there are gender experts. That's why there are gender expert organizations. So really go out there and reach out whenever you're thinking, does gender have something to do with what I'm doing now? Probably yes is the answer. Then go out there and look for your answer.
Or you could just buy my books.
Yes, Ray.
Oh, thank you, Richard. How nice of you. Well, I agree with my colleagues Callum and Marion very much on the recommendations. Thank you for those thoughtful insights to contribute to this discussion. I would also like to add that I think it's very important in our discourse and our work that we're not just considering women as victims and grouping women with children all of the time. Women, of course, are agents as well in many ways, but not making women victims gets to what Callum was saying in terms of looking at the overall project of gender equality in society, and that's a crucial element of that. It's also a matter, I think, of making sure that we understand that men can also be victims, and so when we are talking about victims of war and conflict and armed violence, we are looking at men. And also that men can be civilians, I think is a very important point that Callum raised. When it comes to, for example, drone strikes where men are targeted on the basis of being military-aged males, this is actually an act of gender-based violence. And we need to take this into account when we're incorporating gender perspectives into our work. The last point I want to suggest for everyone is friends don't let friends mansplain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Well, we've come to the end of the first part of this discussion, but now we'd very much like to hear from you. So if you have a question for the panel, or one panelist, or all the panelists, or a comment or a suggestion, please feel free. The floor is open.
We need at least one question before we're allowed to leave. Really useful.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm supposed to my work with DCAPS, calling the challenge.
Could you just press the microphone?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Hello? Hi, so I'm Lisa Broost, I work at DCAF. My question is more about mansplaining than about disarmament. I was wondering if the panel could share tips on kind of how to deal with mansplainers and maybe with resistance more in general when it comes to like trying to integrate gender in various fields. Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question. We have at least 2 and possibly more mansplaining victims here who can share their strategies for dealing with it. Ray?
Sure. Well, there's always the Maxine Waters approach, which I appreciated recently in U.S. Congress, where she just started saying, reclaiming my time, until until the floor was passed back to her. So you can be quite aggressive, and I think at this point, maybe that might be necessary, because I think that this is becoming known now as a popular problem. Certainly when we were working on devising this panel, there was no end to the suggestions, particularly from Marianne and Nora and I, about what this panel could look like and the types of things that we have directly experienced on panels or in conversations or group meetings. So I think it's becoming known as a phenomenon. I think a lot of work needs to be done with male colleagues, of course, in the background before meetings. If you're noticing that your male colleagues are exhibiting any behavior that resembles what you've seen here today, trying to talk to them about it is particularly important. And with any other issue of gender-based violence or sexism, it's always really helpful to have men talk to men as well. So I think this is really a collective effort that needs an appropriate mix of aggressive in-room strategies coupled with behind-the-scenes counseling, basically.
Yes, and to add to that, there was a technique used by female staff under Obama, which was positive reinforcement. So whenever a woman brought up an idea that seemed interesting, all of the colleagues, men and women, would acknowledge that it came from her, and that really reinforces bringing back the floor to the person who had the idea or who had the floor in the first place, which I believe is quite something, that's quite easy to do. For example, oh, Ray, that was a very good point. Thank you very much for bringing that up. It's that easy to do that positive reinforcement. So that's the sort of a counterbalance to what all of the points Ray made, which are very, very good.
Yeah.
So I was actually going to make the same point that Marion made there, which I think is a very good one. I think it's also important when you are, like myself, a white man, that you sometimes realise that you do have a degree of privilege and you try and think about ways that you might be able to use that. So one technique that I have tried to use is that you note that you can actually give the floor to somebody else who's been cut off several times, or you can ask them to explain the point that they were trying to make. But I think in general I get a lot of men ask me about mansplaining, and I think it's important to actually ask women what I could have done in that situation, for example, and I think people forget about that sometimes.
I don't understand a word.
Just to illustrate Callum's point, when we were rehearsing for this, preparing for this panel 2 days ago, and we were rehearsing a sequence where the mansplainer would interrupt a female speaker, and then Callum would say, oh, but wait a minute, I think Marion was making a point, I want to hear what it is. But the question came up, is that the appropriate response? If you're dealing with this situation, do you need then to rely on a man to intervene and reclaim the floor for you? And should a sensitive man intervene in that situation or not? And if he does, well, at least you get to speak. But if he does, then it's kind of, in a way, reinforcing the idea that it has to be done by a man to count. So I don't know what answer we came up with. I think you do intervene, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what we agreed on.
Yes, intervene briefly, but don't take the floor. Any other questions? You're very quiet out there. Yes, Azad, how are you? Yes, please.
Hi, Richard. Thank you. My name is Rasaman from the Malaysian Mission. Good panel. It's very entertaining. The question that I have is, when one speaks about issues related to gender equality and empowerment of women, it a lot of times goes back to issues related to the society at large, but also active policies that governments put in place in terms of perhaps quotas or giving more education opportunities. In our national experience, what we found is, at least in the past 20 years or so, the number of university graduates, of women university graduates have gone up, that now it's about 60-65%. And that has translated, at least in the past 15 years or so, that in the foreign ministry at least, that 60% of new intake of officers are women. And as they themselves move up in the ranks, our delegations have become more diverse simply because there are more women now in the system. But we've also found that many times they're very effective in all the work that we assign to them, whether that's on issues of disarmament, human rights, economic development issues, and so on. But whether in disarmament or in any of those issues, one thing that usually comes about is that the sort of entrenched culture, especially in multilateral diplomacy, is that even whether one is a man or a woman or any other gender, there's an element that remains that the way that the culture is in terms of how people interact, how diplomats interact, tends to still be based on male ways of doing things. So doesn't necessarily mean that in terms of how one behaves that it would reflect your gender. It might just reflect the diplomatic culture of that setting, which in turn is based on years of men shaping that. So what I'd like to ask the panel is that how do you deal with this issue of numbers? Because numbers alone may not necessarily help in changing the sort of entrenched cultures that you have in multilateral disarmament. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Excellent question. Really?
Yeah. Thanks, Zahid, for that question. I think it's really important, actually, and it touches on, I think, what Marian was suggesting in her final recommendations about not just adding women and stirring. And this also really gets us to the difference between the biology and the gender, which is social norms, right? So it's not just about adding biological women into a masculine space and expecting the mode of operation to change. It's about changing the perspectives that are treated as serious and credible within those spaces. So for that to happen, I think you need a mix of things. I think more women does help. I think more recognition of other gendered norms and performances of gender also helps, like Helen was talking about earlier. And I think that together with the numbers changing, there also needs to be more attention paid to the perspectives that are still getting airtime, the viewpoints that are being considered credible, not just who is being interrupted in the room or ridden over in the room, but also who's saying the ideas that are getting ridden over in the room. Because it can sometimes be a man that's raising a point that would be considered from a normative gender perspective somehow soft or weak or feminine or emotional. Did you call me emotional today? I don't remember. You were supposed to. Yeah, not yet. I'm getting there now though, aren't I? Yeah. So yeah, and it can be a man raising that point. It doesn't just have to be a woman that's raising that point. And they can still be shut down for having those ideas, or they learn to self-censor themselves for having those ideas and won't even say them. So I think that we need to be very aware of these dynamics and working within our own systems and with our colleagues all the time to raise awareness about it and to allow other people the space for that. I know one pushback that I've gotten over the years, certainly working in the disarmament security sector with a gender perspective, is I've been described as things like, oh, the gender Nazi, or oh, don't say that in front of Ray, she'll like get mad at you or something like that. But there's no pushback on those people that are saying those types of things, and so others who are exposed to that then learn to censor themselves or think that the person raising the gender perspective is just on this one-track path or something like that. So I think we all need to be a little more careful and you know, work with each other on these issues.
I disagree.
Of course you do.
I think it's very well understood among the community that the types of terms that you've just referred to should never be said publicly or at a time when you can hear them. Great care is apparently taken by a lot of people to sort of tiptoe around those issues and whisper them in the pub afterwards. That is a sensitive way forward from a gender perspective. Clap.
Sorry, my
I have a slightly different perspective on that one. I think I'd like to reiterate some of the points that Ray was making. I think particularly saying that it's not just about adding women in stirring, it's also about fundamental notions of institutional change. Personally, I work a fair bit with the military. I think in that particular context, there's credence given to the notion that we need to talk to the military about women, peace and security and that kind of agenda, but I think perhaps what isn't fully understood is that in order to completely integrate women into militaries, we need to fundamentally change the institutional culture of that military. So that means that men need to have gender training or be engaged in different transformational activities. Coming back to your point also on the diplomatic corps having a particular culture, I think that's very relevant, and I think, again, if we look at institutions, this also comes back to the points that Ray was making before. What kind of values or what kind of attributes are we looking for in the recruitment process? So something that we've noticed with a lot of security forces is there's a very strict belief that we need to retain physical fitness requirements to serve in certain roles. But actually, most security sector actors perform a diverse variety of different tasks. So things like teamwork can be quite important, speaking different languages can be quite important, having university degrees can be quite important. So I think there's also a question about the kind of people that we put in a certain role and what kind of attributes we need for that particular role. So I think there is something to be said by increasing the number of women. I think there's meant to be a statistic that once you bypass 30%, then it's not the woman making the woman's point. And actually, when you've got small numbers of women in a room, they will be discredited, like Ray was saying, if they do raise the gender issue, whereas actually men might be in a better position to do it. So there is some credence to the argument that increasing the number of women in a room will help. And it will also allow men to talk about different topics that they might not otherwise have been able to talk about. But it is also important to look at how we can change the institutional culture overall and how we're going to change that majority culture.
Good, yes. I do agree with both of you, so those were very good points, and something that's, I think, very important to keep in mind when we encounter a situation like this, because it may be the case for disarmament, it's the case for a lot of other sectors and areas, and is why is this place so fundamentally different and maybe even aggressive that women can't be in it? We don't allow them in, or they're not taken seriously or credibly into this situation. And when we found the answers, then we can start working on them. And I think we have a few answers and ways forwards already. Something that I think should also be mentioned is the issue of credibility. So a woman faces different sorts of restrictions when she goes outside what we think is appropriate for a woman to be talking about or doing. If I exert a type of leadership that's common among men, I might be deemed aggressive, right? Or if my leadership is different, I might be called emotional or weak. Or women tend to have this stigma sometimes that whatever it is that they do, especially in, publicly and politically, they're going to be criticized for the way they look, but also just what they do. And, we have a lot of very colorful terms that we've been calling women who are especially aggressive or hands-on, and sign for more flexible types of leadership. And that, for me, really comes to changing the structure that you're in. Why is it that we only favor this one type of way of doing diplomacy in disarmament? That's the real question that needs to be addressed.
Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, no, again, I think we're all in agreement. We need to develop innovative ways of achieving our objectives and ticking boxes without compromising what we're trying to do within an agreed time frame. Thank you.
Well, that's a very succinct summing up. Thank you, Mr. Mann. Any further, Peter, is that something? Yes, at the back, please.
Yeah, Peter Herby with the Norwegian Red Cross and other hats at different times. But my question, well, first of all, thank you for a fantastic, stimulating discussion, which I think is rare, and being so direct and frank on this issue, so thank you. Now the question is, also about framing the discussion. I mean, okay, the title is Mansplaining and Gender and Disarmament, but is perhaps the focus on disarmament, which immediately plays into the issue of security, the right focus? In other words, I guess there's also a gender and a female perspective on security and what it means, which is, I think, probably quite different than a male perspective, or let's say the classical hard-nosed perspective that the mansplainer has well presented. So are we already into a trap by talking about disarmament and arms as opposed to perspectives on what is required for security? Any thoughts would be welcome.
Now I keep getting the floor first. Mr. Mann doesn't want to answer these questions.
I have an answer.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for that question. I can't speak to, for Richard about why he chose this to be the particular title or focus. I would say that from my perspective, the issues of arms and armament and military spending and disarmament are very much tied up with security perspectives, particularly when it comes to gender perspectives on security, because we did touch on a little bit on the sort of militarized notions of masculinities, this concept of violent or militarized masculinities. And so when you couple that with sort of a security analysis, you often get to weapons, war, conflict. That the security paradigm is very much rooted in the ability to project power through military might, which Mr. Mann did an excellent job of demonstrating for us. So for me, it made natural sense to have it be in a disarmament framing. I also think that it's important that we continue to use the D word as much as possible, because in security discourses or even in arms control discourses, it often gets lost, and it's for a long time it's been a very difficult word to say, and you're already not taken seriously if you want to talk about disarmament as opposed to talking about security or arms control. So I think it made sense, but I don't know, Richard, if you had any other points about why you did frame it this way.
No, I mean, that was pretty much it. And also, since it's the Geneva Disarmament Platform, we talk about disarmament. And so, if we're going to add gender and stir, that's the title that came up.
Yeah, I think I would actually add on to both points being made by Rich and Ray there. I think often, so in our perspective, working at DCAF, you're completely right, Peter, to talk about there being different perspectives on security, and I would also just like to highlight that there isn't a male perspective and a female perspective. There are multiple male perspectives and multiple female perspectives as well. So perspectives on security are extremely diverse and involve a lot of different intersecting factors such as race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and that kind of thing. I think within the framework that DCAF works in, we see disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration as being the precursor to security sector reform. So these two things are inherently linked, and security sector reform itself then is connected then to sustainable development. So these three things are fundamentally connected. But I'd also like to come back to a point that Ray was making about using the D word. I think in our experience, it's important that we're having these gender discussions in these kinds of fora. What we found when we work on security sector reform is sometimes we try and engage civil society organisations or women's organisations, and they say, oh no, but security has nothing to do with us. And actually, a lot of our work is looking at ways in which we can engage women's organisations and different civil society organisations into these security discussions, because they actually have quite a lot to say. So if they think they don't have anything to say and they're not engaging, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that security has nothing to do with gender, or disarmament has nothing to do with gender. So I think in our experience, quite to the contrary, it's important that we do recognise the gender element in these different areas, and we make sure that the voices are heard in these different platforms.
Thanks. Mr. Mann, you in fact kicked off this whole discussion on emphasising that disarmament has to be seen in the context of security. And and security is the ultimate goal. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I think mansplaining is an excellent word. I think it's a very useful word when we're framing our discussions around the D word, defence. I think it's a word that projects strength, it projects stability. It allows us to say things in a way that our enemies will take note of, and that allows us to defend ourselves both ethically and actually in these multilateral discussions. I think mansplaining for me it's a bit like explaining used to be before men don't vote.
It's certainly thought-provoking. Marion.
I'm just going to end that by saying that basically I think Ray said it all when she said that disarmament in and of itself is a word that's quite gendered and is tainted with this gendered vision that we all have already. And unfortunately discrediting when you say it out loud to someone who then won't take you seriously anymore. But yes, basically I agree with Callum and Ray, and I think it was a wonderful title for this event.
Thank you. The D word.
Defence.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's not mention the D word. Any, perhaps have time for one or two more questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for this interactive discussion. I think it's important that we talk about this issue, but more often than not, a majority of women attend these types of discussions and events. And so for real change, of course, we need the men to listen to, and by the way, thanks for women guys who are here. So how would you articulate the benefits of putting a stop to gender bias and mansplaining, especially in a way that could interest men? That's my question.
I can take that.
You do?
Let me try and explain this to you in a way that you will understand. In the defence industry, there is a need for constructive, inclusive discussions that will help us, or will lead to practical means that allow us to achieve our objectives. We then need to create detailed work plans that take us in the direction that we have set. And then we need to ask women what they think, to confirm that they agree with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think everything has been said.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's a very important one. Actually, at this point, I would like to acknowledge that Nora did a lot of the promotion here, and that's partly why we have so many men in the room. And also, Annalena has been sticking posters all over decaf. So there is something to be said for bringing men to gender events and telling them there's free food, and that seems to be quite an effective method as well. The point that you make is very important. I think in our experience, there's a couple of different ways, and it's about carrots and sticks. So I think obviously there's a disciplinary issue associated with things like sexual and gender-based violence. So you've got command responsibility. If you've got gender-based violence, for example, being committed by an armed group, for example, the commander is legally responsible for that. So you can say, look, if you don't know what this issue is about, then you're actually the one who's going to be in trouble here. But I think we've worked with the military and found a few different ways to engage people. One of them is to perhaps not always use the word gender initially, and then definitely the word gender bias was a complicated word when we tried to talk about that.
Use the word BO first.
Well, the one that really resonates in the military is leadership. And you say that it's part of leadership, and then that's the kind of language that they can get on board with. Another one, sometimes the equality argument works. You kind of look at what's going to work in the different conversations, but I would also like to share a really interesting example from Sweden. This is the Swedish Gender Coach program, and what they did there was they gave gender advisors to high-ranking military officials who were being considered for promotion to the rank of general. Now, what these gender advisors do is they, by and large, come from civil society backgrounds, and they meet on a monthly basis. They work out a few interventions that that individual can take to try and improve gender equality in their immediate workforce. Now, while in Sweden, obviously, there is some men kind of accept this at face value, but the other thing that became really interesting is if you got allocated a gender advisor, it meant you being considered to be general. So then the men are asking each other, did you get a gender advisor? You got a gender advisor. So then there's kind of incentives there as well. So I think it's a bit of a game. There's carrots and there's sticks, but there are ways to incentivize men. And the final thing I would say as well is looking at how gender-based violence does manifest for men. So when we did a publication on complaints mechanisms, we were looking at what gender-based harassment looks like in the military. Well, that's actually called hazing in most situations, and for most men it's actually really quite unpleasant when these kind of initiation rituals, and really quite unnecessary for the force effectiveness. So it's sometimes looking at how restrictive gender roles can affect men, and that can be a way that works for some people.
Yes, if I can add to that, there's quite a few things that, of course, we're trying to do when we work with people and want to change a certain behavior. One of them is definitely maybe not using the word gender quite out there, because people often equate gender with women, so that I think resonates a lot with what Callum was saying. So using other words, and that's tricking people into coming to gender events about gender without putting gender in the title of the event. That's proven to work out, and very often, naturally, the discussion's going to lead there, but we won't be seen as the gender people imposing gender onto our colleagues and places of work. Unfortunately, we tend to be associated with, I think you use a word similar to that, but like being the gender police when you're a gender person within your organization. So you can own up to that, wear the gender police hat, make fun of it, reclaim it, or trick people in other ways. Something that works very well is, of course, talking about masculinities. So really targeting the right people in the room and changing your discourse to include them. There's quite a few things that can be done, and maybe to increase, next time you go to a panel on gender, bring your male colleague with you, or male colleagues. That works too. So next time I encourage everyone to just grab one of your male colleagues and come to the gender event, so you won't be with only your female colleagues and expose them more. And also something else is make it fun. That's something that we try to do as well, is create events that are fun, like this one, previous one that we've done, worked on bias and attitudes, really trying and aim for that change in attitude that's going to open up certain people who aren't ready to talk about it yet, kind of create circumstances where they're more ready to talk about it, and making it fun is one of them, definitely.
Ray, you mentioned, thanks Mary. Ray, you mentioned something before about, don't say this or Ray will get angry. But what are your thoughts about this question, getting mansplainers and men?
I don't know that I know what your sort of interlude into this is. Why am I?
No, it was just something you said before, and you're giving an example.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I would agree very much with what Marion and Callum had said. This is probably the most men I've seen at a gender-related event. And we do have gender in the title, but we also have man in the title. So I wonder if that's really what helped. I don't know. I know there's the women peace and security field has had this issue, and there's been some initiatives to change the title or something, or some uses of it, to men, peace and security, because it's also about men and masculinities. And I understand these attempts to change the language to sort of trick people into coming, or convince men to take it seriously, but I also think it's just a little bit sad, and that we should have higher expectations and demands of each other as women, men, and others. And that's also, I think, something that's important to recognize, is that we can't just keep falling into the binary all the time. We need to be conscious of something outside of men and women. So I would say, that related to that though, and changing the language that we use, it is also very much about what Callum said about making sure that men understand that gender is also about masculinities and not just about women or femininity. And in this case, I mentioned the drone strikes being a case of gender-based violence when men are targeted on the sole basis of being men. And it's remarkable when I talk about that. We did a report called Sex and Drone Strikes, which I think that gets people into the room, including men. But it's just amazing how when you're giving a presentation on gender, but then you start talking about how men are victims of gender-based violence when it comes to drone strikes, all the men in the room perk up, and suddenly they're more interested, and suddenly they're nodding their heads, whereas before it looked like they were falling asleep. So there is something to this about making it clear that conversations about gender relate to everybody. So we need to do more of that, I guess.
Thanks, Frank. I'm only the moderator, but I can possibly just add something to part of your question, which is, you know, how do you stop the mansplaining? And it was actually, I think the biggest obstacle is that most mansplainers don't know that they're mansplainers. And it was very difficult to find a genuine mansplainer for this event. While a number of colleagues suggested various people to me, all these people, you know, kind of would not see themselves as mansplainers, and it would be awkward to ask them to come and be a mansplainer. So, I mean, this is sort of awareness raising and getting people to understand that maybe the way they're talking or the way they're behaving is having a negative effect on their audience is something, but I don't know how you do that. And the other thing as well, I mean, some of the little things we did at the beginning to, you know, introducing the female participants in the panel differently to the men and talking about their appearance or their age and so on. Nora, I should introduce her. Everyone, this is Nora. She's a colleague at GDP, and she's done most of the work in organising this. It's also actually her last day. Yeah, Nora went to an event just 2 days ago, I think, where an ambassador hosting the event introduced the panel, and who's someone I'm sure who's completely committed to gender equality and all the good things. He's from a country that is, you know, probably one of the world leaders in such issues. And I'm sure he meant no harm whatsoever, but he did pretty much exactly what I did in introducing the women on the panel. And I'm sure it would be mortified to know that he'd done something wrong or inappropriate. And yet he did, and no one's brave enough to tell him things. Any final remarks or comments? Oh, lots now. Lady in red at the back.
Hi, I'll just speak as myself, but I'm working for the Quaker United Nations office at the moment. Just to hook up on the age issue, I think apart from the gender aspect, I think in particular women suffer from the fact that some of us look younger than we might be, and it doesn't actually matter what age we are, but the number of times that in the last 2 years, including the time I spent in the Central African Republic working on mine action and coming back to the Geneva platforms, the number of times I've been taken to the intern taking the notes, the number of times where I've been, I had the impression my father was speaking to me, or the questions I was asked around the dinner table was, how is it to be so young? What do your parents think about what you're doing? And I'm sort of looking around thinking, excuse me. So I think that age aspect is also quite important to just bring in. I think I think everybody sort of mentioned it, but it is something that, in particular women, also with what we're allowed to do or not allowed to do. I think somebody mentioned to me going into the field in the Central African Republic to the northern areas, you know, how can your parents let you go? And I sort of I've been over 18 for years and years and years now. That would never be questioned for somebody who was male going up there with the same security apparatus. Nothing would have been questioned. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's great also that the Quakers are letting interns like you come to this. I hope you've taken good notes. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Vanessa Wiley from the Mission of Canada. but speaking in my personal capacity here, I want to congratulate you. I think the way that this was set up in terms of marketing, having a mansplainer and that clearly on the panel, the picture is perfect. I think it really says that you're going to speak about this very sensitive issue with humor, and I think it's hugely helpful. I mean, I think you're a bit preaching to the converted here today, me, but this kind of thing can be very, very useful. For my part, I'm planning to put a section on this in my report. I hope that the right people read it in Hong Kong. A couple of things that kind of came up for me listening to the talk, especially about institutional change. Incentivizing women to acquiesce or to agree to more hardline positions is something that I see. It comes up for me and also for other women in order to be taken seriously in disarmament is a huge problem. Peace and security, but even more in disarmament, I really see that. And then if they don't acquiesce, if they don't take hardline positions, treating other positions as threatening, or when they try to broach them, when they try to explain, saying that's too complicated, you're being too detailed. Like these kind of things don't necessarily seem to have a gendered origin, but I hear them much more often directed at women. Thank you.
Yes, I see nodding on the panel. Does anyone want to address either of those questions, comments?
I think we all have those experiences, right? I can relate to everything that both of you just said.
I was actually mistaken for an intern last February at a national directors meeting of Mind Action. Yeah.
It's never happened to me.
Yeah. It's never happened to me. So I understand what it feels like. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Anyone else? If not, we might wrap up. Do the panelists want to make any final comments, thoughts? You don't have to. I know Mr. Mann will have something to say.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Callum was saying earlier about not compromising force effectiveness. I'm going to stop listening after that. Thank you.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you've found it both entertaining and informative. Thank you very much to our panel for being game enough to join us, and especially thank you to Mr. Mann. He's not really like this. Not always like this. Sorry, not always like this. He's not always like this. It was rehearsed. We had a lot of fun putting together. But I'm sure, it was perhaps slightly exaggerated, but nevertheless fairly plausible, and you no doubt you've heard similar performances before. But anyway, thank you very much, Rory, for being game enough to do this. And to all those watching us on live stream, again, it's not really like this. So thanks for coming, thanks for your questions and commentary and laughter, and if you want to keep track of what the GDP, the Disarmament platform, is doing, please follow us on Twitter or go to our website. And also a big thank you to Nora, who did a lot of the work running around to put this together. So thanks again, and see you soon.